Let's get this started this week. We want to talk about the big news that came out last week in the world of banking. There is a big merger that's going to be taking place here. BB&T is going to be acquiring SunTrust. That is a deal. They're going to be buying SunTrust for $28.2 billion. It's going to create the country's sixth largest bank after all is said and done. Now, Matt, you've had a chance to go through the mechanics of this deal, the implications. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts on this announcement.
Well, for the most part, I think it's definitely a good move. Now, take this with a grain of salt, because I am always suspicious when companies justify mergers with the term synergies. As in, this is going to create over $1 billion of annual cost saving after this merger is completed, which is exactly what we're hearing here. But in this case, I think it might actually be true. The main reason, BB&T and SunTrust are both generally Southeast-based bank companies. So there's a lot of overlap between their branch networks. So let's say if one town has a BB&T and a SunTrust branch right next to each other, they could consolidate that into one and actually save a good bit of money. So there is substantial cost saving that should be realized here. The other thing, they're moving their headquarters to Charlotte. Right now, one's in Winston-Salem and one's in Atlanta. I can't remember which is which off the top of my head. But they're moving to Charlotte, which is a big banking hub. Bank of America is based there. Wells Fargo's East Coast operations are pretty much based there. So there's a huge talent pool of just great banking talent there.
Yeah.
And it's just I love the move to Charlotte. And this should give them, not only are they going to be the sixth largest bank in America, but this should make them a dominant force in the Southeast. I'd say about half of my friends down here bank with either BB&T or SunTrust. So now this will kind of combine their forces and just give them a really good market share in their core area. On the other hand, there are some downsides. You mentioned this is going to be the sixth largest bank. Combined, they're going to have about $440 billion in assets. That puts them over that puts them over the key $250 billion mark to become a systemically important financial institution, or SIFI. The bigger you are in banking, the tighter you're regulated. Not as big of a concern right now, given the current administration. But after 2020, if the other party gets in power, they might crack down on banking regulations, and they're not going after the small ones.
Yep.
So that's my biggest concern about the deal, is that this kind of could increase regulatory pressure on them. I think it'll be more than offset by the cost saving that I just mentioned and just kind of the market share advantage. But definitely a good move. It's nice to see some mergers happening in the banking world again. We've had a ton in the other sectors, but not much in banking lately.
For sure. And I mean, speaking of mergers, I mean, as the interview with Ameris' CEO there, Dennis Zember, noted, and we talked about on the show here briefly a time ago, is this acquisition with Ameris Bancorp and Fidelity, which, I mean, let's be clear, that's a tiny deal, right? That's bringing together essentially a $1.5 billion market cap bank with a $750 million market cap bank. I mean, they're going to have total assets somewhere in the neighborhood of $17 billion. So that's apples and oranges. But I want to go back to something that Dennis was talking about in our interview, because I feel like this was perfect timing, having his interview lining up with the news on this merger, because we get an understanding of the challenges and opportunities for both organizations there. I mean, Dennis said in that interview that the deal with Fidelity gives them really the opportunity to drive an identity as a real alternative in the super regionals sector in big markets like Atlanta, Orlando, Jacksonville, Charleston. I'm sure North Carolina will come into play there as well. But we talk about scale and how this is going to create this BB&T and SunTrust deal is going to create the sixth largest bank. And I mean, Dennis made the point there that just being big these days in the banking industry isn't enough. And I mean, it comes down to not only footprint, but he feels like their advantage at Ameris, that attitude and willingness to fight for the business they want. He feels like they're going to be able to surprise some people because of that culture they have with the company. And perhaps the advantage there in being a bit smaller and being a bit more nimble, and maybe not necessarily on regulators' radar like these bigger banks are going to be.
Yeah, definitely. It's not always great to be big, especially in a heavily regulated industry. Banking being probably the most heavily regulated industry in the world.
Understandably, I mean,
sure. But especially the ones at the top, you know, I mean, you've seen how much Wells Fargo's in the news, and it's not. And I mean, there have been small banks that have, you know, acted just as badly as Wells Fargo, but you don't hear about them because they're not as scrutinized and as in the spotlight. So this is definitely going to put them in the spotlight. I'm curious as to what the new name's going to be.
Okay,
that was thoughts on that?
You just jumped in it because we were just talking about that before taping as Chris and Abby were leaving the studio from taping today's Market Foolery. We started kicking around some ideas because you got to figure that the nature of this deal, you feel like probably they just brand everything to BB&T, right? I mean, combining those two names is going to probably be pretty difficult. My observation, SunTrust sounds too much like a soda, right? And if you try to combine the two, I mean, maybe the best case scenario, you get something like Sunny B. I don't know. But all I'm saying is I think it's probably easiest to go with one or the other as opposed to making some newfangled name that no one has any real understanding of from a brand perspective, right?
Yeah, that could be actually one of the potential risks of the deal is that no one's going to know what this brand is that they're going to create because they've already said they're not going to keep either of the names. They're going to go with something new.
Oh, okay. So it definitely is going to be either one. Well, hey, everybody, come back with Sunny B. We've got a great offer for you there on interest rates. That will make you smile with our date. Put you in a good mood. I don't know.
Which one do you think has better national recognition, BB&T or SunTrust?
I tend to lean towards BB&T. I mean, being from the Southeast, I feel like I've had exposure to both of them. But I mean, I'm sure there are people out there that would say they're more familiar with SunTrust as well. It strikes me that's going to be a big challenge for them coming up with a new name that really resonates with consumers.
Yeah, I mean, it's been done before and surprised me in the past, but we'll have to see what they come up with.
Yep, we shall see.